Everybody, and welcome back to the next part in my Creating a Great Tone series for our Line 6 Helix. By far over the last couple of years, probably the biggest request I have had has been to do a video in how I would set up to utilize the Helix in 4-cable method with a real tube amp. Now, up until now, as many of you know, I haven't been able to do that because I don't own any tube amps. I got rid of all my tube amps after I got the Helix. That's how happy I am just using the Helix standalone for everything, you know, my amp and everything. But there are a lot of folks out there who still want to utilize it in conjunction with their tube amp rig. And 4-cable method is a great way to do that. So recently, some of you might have seen, I did a video yesterday on the new Rev G20, Rev Amplification G20 head, which is kind of a hybrid head on its own, having the 2 notes torpedo built into it to get the possibility of sending it direct to front of house or to audio interface so that we don't have to mic it up or have it plugged into a normal cab. But it still is going to serve the purpose for me to show how I would use 4-cable method. So the way I do have this set up though is I have it coming out of the torpedo remote into my IK Multimedia Axe IO as the interface. So I'm using the torpedo and the torpedo remote software as a virtual cabinet. But that doesn't change how I would set it up for 4-cable method. I'm still utilizing the channels of the amp, all right? So I thought a lot about how I could go about explaining this, and I thought the best way would be to go kind of in order of signal flow. I'm not going to show you how the cables are plugged into the Helix and the amp, but I will describe that. Very detailed, hopefully, so you guys can follow. I think the way I explain it, hopefully it'll be clear to everybody. So let's do this. Let's go over to HX Edit to start off with. So here we are at HX Edit, and kind of a departure for me is there's a completely blank preset here. Now, here's what happens. Let's talk about the first cable connection we have to make of the 4-cable method. And that is my guitar cable right here, plugged into my guitar. This cable, you know, is where it all starts, right? This is where the signal's coming from. This has to go somewhere. Normally, using just a standard tube amp, we would plug that directly into the input jack on the front of the tube amp, or possibly into some pedals that we would want to be in front of the tube amp. Right? So this guitar has to go somewhere. So, you know, what pedals might we want in front of the tube amp? Well, we might want a compressor pedal there. We might want a wah pedal there. We might want a distortion pedal there, just to name a few, right? Those are sort of traditionally effects that we're going to put before the amp rather than in the effects loop, okay? So what we're going to do, and since we're using our Helix for any possible effects, you know, wah, compressor, distortion, like I just mentioned, we want to plug this into the guitar input, our guitar straight into the guitar input of the Helix. So like we would normally do if we were just using the Helix as a standalone unit, right? Okay, so what that's going to do then is if we can envision the signal flow, it's going to come into this input here, which I have set to multi, which I could also set to guitar, right, for the purpose that we need. Now, I'll just leave it a multi because that also includes guitar and variacs and others. So we'll leave it at that. Now, the signal is now flowing through this path, which then goes to a multi-out. Well, we need to do some stuff through here. But first of all, let's do this. I'm just going to add a few effects here, even though these aren't going to be of any use yet until we set this up properly. But let's do this. I'll go in and I'll add a compressor first in the chain, let's say. Let's put a deluxe comp there, and I'll just give it some quick settings as I would kind of maybe normally set it. Let's do that, and then I don't know, a little bit of parallel compression here. It's going to bring that level back a little bit and threshold up. We'll figure that out once. This is really about the settings. I just want to have the signal flow going more or less, and then. Let's all do that. Let's also do this. Let's put in Diana drive. Really love this overdrive pedal. Okay, and we'll just turn those off for now. Now, at this point, let's say that that's all we want to go before our amp. So our guitar is plugged into here, and this signal is flowing through these pedals. I now want to send that signal out to the input jack on my amp. All right. So I'm going to come over here to where it says send and return. I'm just going to take a mono send and I'm going to go send out, okay? And that's now going to send the signal out of send number 1 on the back of my Helix. But now what we need to do is run cable number 2, okay? So we're going to run a cable out of send 1 on the back of our Helix to the guitar input of our guitar amplifier or head, combo head, whatever you're using. Now, there's going to be another setting I'm going to talk about later in the video from our global settings on the Helix. I'm going to save that till later to try to keep this as concise as possible. So we're not ready to use this yet. I'm going to talk about another setting that I think a lot of people miss, and that can be the source of some people's problems, okay? So let's just leave it at that for now. So what we've done is we've plugged our guitar straight into the Helix, guitar input, that's running through these effects which I want before my amplifier. So this send is then going to take our next cable from send 1 on our Helix, the back of our Helix connections, and send that to the guitar input of my amp, which happens to be sitting right here, okay? Hope that's clear. So this really represents the point at which the signal leaves the Helix and goes to the guitar amp. Well, now we want to put effects after the preamp stage of the guitar amp. You know, the preamp stage is oftentimes where we get our distortion from if we have a couple, 2-channel amp or 3-channel amp. And some effects sound better after the distortion, after the preamp stage. Okay? So, stuff like delays, stuff like reverb, sometimes chorus. Some people like chorus before, some people like chorus after. That's not up for debate here. That's a personal preference. But we want to have the ability to put some effects after the preamp stage, okay? That's where the guitar effects loop is going to come into play. So what we need to do is we need to return this signal after the preamp portion of the guitar amp back to the Helix. Okay. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to think of the signal flow on the amp. On the amplifier itself, we go into the guitar input. That signal flows through the preamp. And then, in between the preamp and the power amp, we have an effects loop, which can send the signal back out of the amp and then return it back in. In case, not using the Helix, let's say we want to put a delay pedal there. Let's say we have a little Boss delay pedal, right? We come the send out of the effects loop to the input of the pedal, the output of the pedal to the return of the effects loop. And now that delay pedal is in the chain after the preamp stage, if that makes sense. And hopefully that's clear to everybody. So what we need to do is we need to take the send out of the effects loop and hook that up to the return on the Helix. Now some folks would use return 1. Let's go back to our center return here. I'm going to actually use return 2, and I'll explain that later why. Some folks might say, well, why are you using up a whole other loop? That doesn't make sense. But you'll see why when I talk about the global settings. So let's put return 2 in there. So just to recap, we have our guitar cable going into the Helix guitar input. The signal is flowing through these effects that we want before our amp. We then go from send 1 out of the Helix into the guitar input of the amplifier. Okay, now we're hitting the preamp stage of the amplifier. We take the send out of the effects loop of the guitar amplifier or guitar head and put it into the return 2 on the back of the Helix. Okay, so we have 1 cable, 2 cables to send it to the amp, and a 3rd cable to return it back to the Helix. All right. What I do want to do on this is set my mix to 100%. Okay, that's another important point. All right, so now what I can do is we've returned to the Helix. I can now start adding the effects that I want after the preamp stage, or in the effects loop of the guitar amp, essentially. So I'm going to add a delay. Let's go down to a transistor tape. And again, I'll just set this to kind of, normal settings that I kind of default to. And I'll do that. That's probably fine. Okay, and then I'm going to also put a reverb. Let's, I don't know, let's go to legacy reverb. Let's put a plate reverb. Knowing what I know about that, that might be a little much. Let's go 5. Let's leave that for now. Again, this isn't about the settings of the effects. That's going to be a personal preference thing. All right, so now, again, let's recap. I hate to recap all the time, but I think it's really important so that folks can constantly keep this in their head. We're coming out of our guitar with our first cable, okay? That's going to the guitar input of the Helix. That signal is then flowing in here on our path 1A, going through these effects that I chose. You can have whatever you want there. That is then going to a send block, which is sending the signal back out of the Helix. So we hook a cable up, our second cable, to send 1, which is sending the signal out of the Helix into the guitar amp's front guitar input. Okay? We then take another cable, our third cable of the 4-cable method, and we take it out of the send of the guitar amp, sending it out of the guitar amp, and we're returning it to the Helix by plugging that into return 2. And we set our mix at 100%. Clear on that so far? Now we added our effects that we want to be in the effects loop, which is going to be right here. Okay, well there's one final thing we need, and that is our 4th cable. We now have to go to our final output block here, and I'm going to set this to the 1/4 inch output. The reason for that, and I guess I could have left it at multi as well. I believe the multi includes that. But anyways, whatever, don't worry about that. That's not important. We'll set this to the 1/4 inch output, and this is where our 4th cable comes in. We now have to complete the loop of the effects loop, right? We've sent the signal out of the guitar amp into the Helix, but now we have to send it back out. So we're going to use the 1/4 inch output, and we're going to send that to the return of the effects loop on the amp. So there's your 4 cables, right? Again, let's recap. Guitar, cable, comes out into the Helix, guitar input. That then flows through whatever effects we have in our pre-section, our preamp section, before the amplifier. We then take a send out of send 1. We hook a cable up from send 1 on the Helix to the guitar input on the amplifier. We then take a cable from the send on the guitar effects loop, because we have to get the signal back into the Helix, and we plug it into return 2 on our Helix. And we then have a return block here that accepts that signal back, set with the mix at 100%. Now we put our post effects in. So post preamp effects, post amplifier effects. These are the ones that are going to be in the effects loop. Again, it's whatever we choose. Then after that, the signal needs to return to the guitar amplifier, so it can then go out to our power amp built into our guitar amplifier and our speaker cab. Okay? And we take another cable, the final cable, and we go from the 1/4 inch output on the Helix back to the return of the effects loop on the guitar amp, if that makes sense. Hopefully that's clear. I hope that's clear. Okay, so now we're set up. That's pretty simple. Now some folks, like I said, might ask, why did you do this separate send and return when I could have just gone down here to send return and used effects loop 1, let's call it. And that would take care of the send and the return all in one. Here's why, okay? And I'm going to take my cell phone and do some videotaping down. I hope the quality is probably not going to be as good, but it'll get the point across. We're going to go down to global settings on our Helix. So bear with me here for this. So here we are down on my Helix itself, and I want to show you how to get into the global settings and make some changes that we need to make, or that it's just going to basically optimize our 4-cable method. So first things first, here's the preset that I have just created. Let's save that so that it doesn't go anywhere. Okay, so now to go to global settings, we want to go up to our little hamburger button up here. And you'll see here it says global settings at the bottom. So we're going to press this one. Now, what I have here is ins and outs, okay? And this is where I want to be. There's different pages to this. I've already been in here. So the first page is this. We're going to page over. And this allows us now to set our various inputs, outputs, sends, returns to different levels, either instrument or line. Okay, so let's think this through. A lot of folks I hear will say, you know, I have it set up in 4-cable method, but it's really clipping and distorting. It's hitting my amp in a funny way. Well, here's the thing. Our guitar amp input is designed to have a guitar or instrument level input sent into it. Now, as we see, when we do this, we can change send return 1 to either line or instrument. Well, I want that on instrument, But if you notice now why I didn't just lump together send and return into an effects loop block in the Helix, that would have painted me in the corner of having to have return 1 also be set to instrument. Maybe I want that, but maybe I don't. So I wanted the flexibility of being able to assign it differently. So the way I've assigned this, and I think the most important point is that your send going into the guitar amp out of send 1 must be set to instruments, okay? I think this is one of the most important things in my opinion that we need to do. And I'll give you some examples when we start playing of what happens if that isn't set to that. Now, because after that, our return 2 is coming back from the guitar amplifier's send, that is going to be an already preamped signal. So I'm setting my return 2 to line. I could also set that instrument. It's not going to do any harm to anything if this is set wrong, but we're going to have to experiment. And here's the other thing. These are the settings I found that worked great with the Rev G20. Your mileage may vary. You may find that you have to set this to instrument as well. I don't know. I don't know what everybody's setup's going to be, okay? And then the other one we're using is the 1/4" output, right, which is returning the sound to the amp, which the power amp is very likely expecting to see more of a line level signal rather than a lower instrument level signal. I think the important thing is to keep these two on the same setting, regardless of what we're going to do. If we're going to go instrument, but your signal is likely going to be lower. So I have these set to line, but I think, you know, experiment with yours. If you're hearing something wonky, if you're hearing something that sounds like it's clipping or maybe your signal's too low, play around with these. But I would try to keep those the same, just in my opinion anyways. And the one thing that I would say must be set, in my opinion, would be the send 1 set to instrument, okay? And in a lot of people explaining 4-cable method, I find that this is a point that's left out that's a pretty pertinent detail. So now that I have that set up, let's go back up to HX Edit and see what this all sounds like. All right, so here I am back from my little trip down to the floor to show you the global settings. Now that we have that set up, let's take a listen to how this all sounds and if it actually works. Let's turn the delay off for now. I'll leave the reverb on. I'll have these pre-effects off. Let's see what happens when I just play something. That's how I have the rev to sound. It's on the clean channel, clean sound, maybe with a humbucker, hit really hard. Slightest edge of breakup tone. You'll have to set that how you want on your amp. But that's basically my setting for the clean, unaffected sound. Now, if I turn the reverb off, so you see how the path seems to be working. I have my reverb where I want it. You hear it right there. Perhaps if I turn the delay on. Works fine, right? Now, before that, I also had a compressor. It's working. I also have the Diana drive. And we can set that however we want for the amount of overdrive that we desire. So now that we have overdrive in there, I can then turn the delay on and see if the delay's acting as I want it. So you see again, these here, the compressor and the distortion are hitting the front of the guitar amp into the guitar input. Then that signal is being returned to the Helix, and then we put these effects in, which are in the effects loop of the guitar amp, which then go back to the return of the guitar amp, and then out to our speaker cabinet. In my case, I'm using the Torpedo remote. So what we're hearing is a real tube amp with the effects of the Helix being used. Now we can go one step further here. Actually, what I want to do is I'm going to turn this off. Let's go back and discuss again what happens with the instrument input. So I'm going to use my foot here. I think I can do it. Here's the instrument input just on clean. When when I have send one sent to instrument. Let's change it to line. We're now hitting the input of the amp harder. And not in a way I really want to. Okay, if I switch back to, whoops, sorry, instrument, it cleans up nicely. So a lot of the folks, a lot of the complaints I've got is that people say, well, I set up 4-cable method correctly, but you know, I can't get anything clean out of it. It's destroying. Yeah, well, it's hitting the front end of your amp harder in a way that probably wasn't really designed to be hit. So that's the issue, right? Now, what happens if I go and turn, you know, return to and 1/4 inch output back to instrument? One was on, both on instrument, both on line. Basically the same thing. This effects loop seems to be able to handle either perfectly fine. But like I said, your mileage may vary on that. Sorry, my chair's sliding around here. Your mileage may vary on that. It depends on the amp you're using. It depends on the effects loop and you know how that was designed. So the nice thing is we have that flexibility. I think the important thing is just having the knowledge that we have the ability to go into global settings and set it to where we need it. I would suggest, though, that the instrument, that the send one is set to instrument so that we're hitting the guitar input of the amp with the proper signal level that it needs, which it expects, which is more of a guitar level signal. Okay? Again, you could have it set any way. You're not going to damage anything, but it's just about optimizing the sounds we want. Now, the final thing I can do here is I could then say, well, let's start assigning these to sort of a pedal board situation. I'm going to put this in my stomp box mode, and I could just say, okay, I want my compressor assigned to foot switch 7, and there it is. I'm going to assign my distortion to be turned on and off on foot switch 8. I'm going to put my delay on foot switch 9, and I'm going to put my reverb on foot switch 10. So now I've designed it here so I can have at my toes ability to compressor on. Something like that. Yeah, so I mean, we've got this beautiful sort of setup where we've turned the Helix into a pedal board integrated beautifully with a tube amp, right? Actually, one other thing here before I say anything else, I can also now switch channels on my amp to the red channel. Right? And I could still hit the front end with more distortion. Yeah, not really, but anyway, I haven't played that in ages. That's a tricky little line. Anyway, so we can then use either channel on our amp and it's fine. Now, some folks might find too that they want to have different levels, right, from clean and when they switch their distortion in. Maybe they want that distortion to be a little bit louder, so we can go down to our level control here, bump that up. You know, that's up to you to balance how you see fit for it, okay? But what I was going to say is we could add in some of the preamp blocks, right? We could go down to something like the Placator Dirty. I was going to say the RevGen Red, but we already have it here. Let's put the Placator Dirty in here and see what happens. Now, some folks say, why did I put it after? Why did I put that in the effects loop? Well, if you think about it, all of these things here are hitting the front end of the amp. So it's going to go into the preamp. So we'd be preamping a preamp, which there's an argument to be said that's what an overdrive pedal is kind of doing too. But I find a lot of times these are designed to be there and to push that preamp. Whereas these preamps are just kind of designed to be the preamp section of an amplifier. This is just the way I look at it. So let's listen to it. The beautiful part about this is, because it's in the digital world, we can just reorder effects, right? We could just take this and drag it over here. Now guess what? I didn't have to patch any cables anywhere. Now I'm hitting the front of the amp with this preamp. Well, let's hear what that sounds like. Let's listen to it after. You see, it's going to react with the preamp of the amp and maybe hit it in a way we don't want, or maybe hit it in a way we do want. But I'm kind of digging the way this sounds after. Okay? Even crank up more overdrive. Sounds nice. Now, that might start to introduce a little bit of noise into the signal. So what we could do, we could come down and, sorry, where are we here? There. We could add a noise gate and just drag that right here before, and then set that to sort of the lowest place where it cuts off any noise. Right? And it's not going to affect the trails on any of this because we have it before our delay and our reverb and whatnot. If we put it after, that would likely chop off the end of the delays. If it was, I guess if it was set differently. Yeah, so you kind of chopped it off there. So it all depends on the settings that you use, but I would prefer to put the gate right there. And again, what we could then do is put both of these things. Now, this is kind of interesting. I could assign the bypass of the preamp I just put in to foot switch 11, and I could also assign the gate to that as well, so that when I turn on and off the preamp, the gate also engages and disengages because we might not want it on our clean sound. If I go to my Diana drive, and that off, back to our preamp. All right. What do you folks think? Hopefully that answers some questions that I've been asked many, many times. That's just the way that I would do it. There's probably lots of ways to do this. There's so many routing possibilities in the Helix. That's the way I chose. And I hope that works for some. I mean, we can also utilize path 2 as well, just by going over to this 1/4 inch output and setting that to path 2A, and then setting this over here to our 1/4 inch output. And that shouldn't affect anything at all. I still can get the same tones I was using before. It would just free up more space to add more blocks and more effects, right? So, hopefully that was helpful. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. If you have any questions, please leave them for me. If I have a chance to get to them, I will. I don't always, but I will do my best. So thanks so much for watching. Please like the video, share it with everybody and anybody, and especially with anybody you think will find it helpful. I think there's a couple things in there about the settings and the global settings that might help some folks to kind of get, optimize this in a way that's going to work really well for them. Thank you guys for tuning in. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and hit the little notification bell so you sort of see when I put new videos out, and I'll be back soon with a lot more content. Thank you guys again for tuning in, and ciao for now.